get started on the last distinguished seminar speaker series of the Civil Environmental Engineering Department for the term. This is a series that was started by CEE, that is sponsored by the department and the Chengmei funds. And we had a series of speakers. We'll resume next spring, so I invite everybody to look at the schedule. And it's my great honor today to introduce Professor Simon Levin. I hope I... Closer. And Simon Levin has been a George Moffett Professor of Biology at Princeton University since 1992. His research interests span a very large range, and particularly focus on macroscopic patterns and processes that are maintained at various levels of the ecosystem. He's recipient of many fellowships and a member of many academies. So one of them is the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, as well the member of the National Academy of Science and the American Philosophical Society. Among many other awards, he won the MacArthur and the Eminent Ecologist Award of the Ecological Society of America and the Okubo Prize of the Society for Mathematical Biology. He has also been honored with the Tidal Prize for Environmental Achievement and the Kyoto Prize for Basic Science. He has mentored hundreds of students, I hear, and many more postdocs. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Simon Levin.
Thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to be here. It almost wasn't. I decided to check out your facilities and couldn't find my way back here. Didn't know the number of the room, and nobody had ever heard of the lecture. So, but I had pictures of leaving you all sitting here. A nightmare I've had many times, and thought was. But anyway, it didn't work out. So it's always a pleasure to come here. I have many friends and collaborators here. My son was a postdoc. My son-in-law is on the faculty. And my granddaughter is across at Boston University, so it's great to be here. Before I get started, I want to thank the various sources of funding. I won't go through them all, but over the years, I appreciate the support. So I'm going to talk to you today about sustainability, which I think is the central problem that's facing societies, and therefore a central problem facing science as to how to approach this problem. And there are only some aspects of it I'll be able to talk about today. One of them is how you measure what sustainability is. But the basic issue is how do we grow economically without compromising the options that future generations have? So implicit in this is that there are scientific questions, and there are social questions, and there are ethical questions. Sustainability means many different things to different people. It means the stability of the financial markets and economic security. It means the stability of energy sources and other resources that are disappearing. It means the maintenance of biological and cultural diversity. But for me today, the focus is on what are called ecosystem services. These are the services that biodiversity and ecological systems provide us in terms of food, fiber, fuel, pharmaceuticals, the mediation of climate, and the indirect benefits like the ethical and aesthetic pleasure we get out of systems, their intrinsic right to exist. The key research questions that are going to shape the lecture today are, and I won't say much about what the services are, but this is obviously a central theme. What do we derive from these systems? But more importantly, how do those emergent properties depend upon the more microscopic features of ecological systems? How do we scale up? What makes them robust, and when are we in danger of losing that? And how can we protect them, which is the last part of the lecture, and that will get me into the social and economic dimensions, probably a less familiar topic to many of you. So ecosystems, I don't mean to have any sound on there, don't need it. And the biosphere are complex systems. They're indeed what has come to be called complex adaptive systems. That means, like this fantastic video of starlings over Rome, they're made up of a lot of individual agents who are following their own. Oh, by the way, one of those birds in there is not a starling, it's a hawk that's driving a lot of this activity. Anybody trained in, my PhD was basically in fluid dynamics, so when you look at something like this, It really makes you think I can describe that the way I would a fluid. I can develop an appropriate statistical mechanics, et cetera. But for now, let's just focus on the fact that these are heterogeneous collections of individual agents, individual units, that interact with each other on a local scale and change their behaviors. There are emergent outcomes that feed back to affect the individual behaviors. So these are what are called complex adaptive systems. The adaptive aspect is at the local level, is at the individual level. It doesn't mean that the system is getting better, and therein lies the crux of the problem. So to me, this implies a need to relate phenomena across scales to how do you go from cells to organisms, from organisms to groups of organisms, all the way up to ecosystems and the biosphere, and to ask questions like, how robust are the properties of ecological systems? Their stoichiometric patterns, et cetera. How does the robustness of the macroscopic property relate to things that are going on much finer or shorter scales? And are ecosystems at tipping points, at critical points? So I hope to touch on all of these before talking about the management aspects. So in any introductory ecology course, one's presented with a diagram of this sort. In this case, this is a modification of a Holdridge diagram that Robert Whittaker developed. And basically it says if you know what the temperature is in the region and the precipitation, you have a pretty good idea of what the vegetation is. You know where to find tundra, you know where to find tropical forests, et cetera. It doesn't mean you know which tree species are there, and I'll come back to that, but you know what kind of vegetation. But this is not the complete story. Within some of these regions, there's still some uncertainty, and you can see that in maps of this sort. Together with my student, Carla Staver, and Sally Archibald, a visiting student from South Africa, I've been interested in the distribution of savanna, the distribution of grassland and forest, and in various regions of the world. We've been working mainly in South Africa, but Carla looked at the MODIS data sets and found this distribution of these types of biomes around the world. Now, there's some areas that are deterministic savanna areas, deterministic grassland areas, like this region up here, and indeed are grassland. And there are other regions which are deterministic forests, like this region here, and indeed are forests. But then there are regions in between in which that climate envelope that I showed you to begin with doesn't specify exactly what what should be there. It could be savanna and it could be forest. So it's, as I will show you, what we think is a bistable region. Some parts of the bistable region are savanna, some are forests. There's a bistability that depends on initial conditions, and of course also depends on what's nearby. So that's why these boundary regions are right in between the areas that are deterministic, one or the other. So I'll come back to that. In fact, we're working on the spatial dimension now, and I won't talk much about that today. But what we think is going on is that fire is an important determinant of whether you've got savanna or whether you've got forests. And the idea there is that grass stimulates the production, stimulates fire, and that fire prevents the small saplings from growing up to be big trees. But if they escape in size, then they are relatively stable. They won't burn. And so the system has a grass-dominated stable state, and it has a forest-dominated stable state. And the question is whether it can escape in size from fire. Of course, the frequency of fire depends upon levels of precipitation. So we set out to model this, and the only model I'll show you, but although we have some more complicated ones, is a relatively simple one. It says that the area can either be occupied by grass, by saplings, or by savanna trees. I'm ignoring here the fact that there may be just bare space because the grass comes in relatively quickly. And most of these terms are quite simple. Their saplings die at a concentration independent rate mu, and that's converted back into grass. Savanna trees die, and that's converted back into grass. The savanna trees produce seeds that grow into seedlings that replace the grass ultimately by saplings, and that's a nonlinear term because it's related to the amount of grass that's available to take over and the number of trees that are producing it. But the key term here is this one here. It's the rate that saplings grow to become savanna trees. And that rate, which is of course proportional to the number of saplings, depends on the amount of grass, which depends upon, which governs the probability that fire will become prevalent in the system. And we have, I'm not going to show it to you, we can fit this transition function up, as you see in the upper right, either empirically or using a fire spread model, in which is basically a percolation model in the landscape with a certain probability of fire spreading from site to site. And in both cases, it gives us a functional form more or less like this, with a relatively steep transition at a critical, basically, percolation threshold. Now, this is a fairly simple system. It's, as you can see, a three-dimensional system. And if you look at it carefully, you see it's really only a two-dimensional system because everything adds G plus S plus T adds up to 1. One of these equations is redundant. There are only two independent equations, so we can draw isoclines for both of them, see where those isoclines cross, do stability analysis, see which ones are stable and which are not. And what we find is that depending on the precipitation level, which determines this line up here, I don't seem to be able to, this line up here, this system either has one stable equilibrium at low grass level or one stable equilibrium at the high level, but in between it's got two stable equilibria and an unstable one in between. So in fact, the picture looks more or less like this. This is the precipitation level. And if you look at the amount of area that's covered by grass, at low precipitation levels, fires are frequent, so frequent that the forest never can get going, and you're at that high equilibrium point dominated by grass. At high precipitation, fires don't get going, and the system sits down here at a low grass level, high forest cover level. But in between, there is a bistability, and in fact, if the precipitation level changes, then we would expect the potential to see sudden flips of the system. If somehow the precipitation level changed back and forth, this could lead to hysteretic loops. So this insight, if correct, is important for understanding how these systems will respond to climate change. We would expect to see rapid, potentially threshold transitions. The change won't be easy to reverse. And this is not unique. I gave this as an example because we've worked on this system. But the idea has been suggested recently by Martin Skeffer and Steve Carpenter for shallow lakes, which flip from oligotrophic to eutrophic states, and due to phosphorus loading. Certainly, this is characteristic of models of pest populations, disease dynamics. And the question is, does it apply to the geophysical aspects of the Earth system? This was a paper that appeared a few years ago involving a number of people looking at different dimensions of the system, suggesting that maybe our biosphere was approaching thresholds. And Tim Lenton and others have been looking at the climate systems in this regard. So not only the biological systems, but the socioeconomic systems that they're interlinked with also exhibit many of these characteristics. They're made up of individual agents who are doing their own investments, their own trading, and indeed we see critical transitions. Stock markets crash because of the collective consequences of many individual actions. We saw this not too many years ago, and many such transitions have characteristic early warning signals, and this has generated a lot of interest recently, especially due to Martin Skeffer's work, but I was involved in this paper, as to whether we can detect when a system is about to change state. So we know that many systems exhibit features. For example, if we look at this cartoon of a ball sitting in a well, as that landscape changes, the stability of that well may be vanishing, and that may result in what's called critical slowing down. And associated with that, increasing variance, increasing autocorrelation, and maybe the flickering between states. Maybe we're seeing that in the climate systems. But one has to be careful with this. And give, for example, this paper by two of my former students, Carl Bodeger and Alan Hastings, and a colleague, suggesting that not just like, as we know, there are many different kinds of phase transitions in physical systems. There are many ways that systems can suddenly change. And depending on the characteristics of the system, we may see those early warning signals, we may not. So I think an interesting question is to try to determine whether we can see those signals in the historical record, not only for climate systems and biological systems, but for physiological systems, et cetera. I want us to be careful. When I first got into this field, catastrophe theory, as expounded by René Thom, was very popular. It was another attempt to explain how systems suddenly transitioned using a somewhat different dynamical systems approach. And indeed, it provided its own early warning of the collapse of a theory because it got oversold. So I think one has to be very careful while exploring a promising theory not to oversell it. Nobody talks much about catastrophe theory today. There are also those are sort of dynamic indicators of whether a system is nearing collapse. We can also look to some of the structural features of the system and ask, what is it about systems that makes them robust? And are these features missing from systems we may be interested in? From evolutionary theory, we understand that evolutionary change is driven by the diversity and heterogeneity of genetic material. When systems become oversimplified, then they don't have the capacity to adapt. You may not be, Ari Goldberger at Harvard and Tim Buckman and their colleagues have been looking at heart rhythms, and some people have nice periodic heart rhythms and others have chaotic heart rhythms. I won't ask you to guess which one you'd like to have. It turns out if you've got a nice periodic heart rhythm, you ought to drive right to the hospital. It's the chaotic rhythms that do much better because they have the capacity to adapt. The redundancy, at least the functional redundancy of elements, if we lose key elements, do we have replacements? And modularity, which is a theme which I'll come back to at the end. Modularity helps to restrict the spread of disturbances and also provides us building blocks. So if it's not clear what I mean by modularity, I will come back to it. But indeed, let me give you one example. In 2008, and I emphasize this is in the spring of 2008, 6 months before Lehman Brothers collapsed, Bob May and George Sugihara and I, this came after George and I attended a meeting that the Federal Reserve had organized about systemic risk in banking systems. And we wrote this paper that said, we're just ecologists, but it seems to us as we look at the banking system, and here you see the Fedwire transfers, a highly complex interconnected system. And if we compare this to ecological systems, such interconnectedness, such lack of modularity is a dangerous trend. We said, who knows, for example, for instance, how the present concern over subprime loans will turn out. Now, as I say, I wish I had read this paper and not just written it. Because 6 months later, the markets indeed collapsed, and the general explanation was they weren't modular enough. They were, it wasn't too big to fail, it was too interconnected, and therefore it failed. So these sorts of indicators can be important. The challenges of complexity theory are to understand the robustness and resilience of these systems to critical transitions, which we have already talked about, and secondly, how to scale from the microscopic to the macroscopic. So in order to understand better what's going on, we have to really understand mechanistically what's going on. Can we build models that allow us to scale up from the microscopic to the macroscopic? So I talked about ecosystem services at the beginning. And all ecological systems have characteristic regularities in the macroscopic pattern. That's how we recognize them. Those are the features we want to protect. Those are the features that sustain the ecosystem services that we depend upon. We don't want to preserve every species at the densities that they currently exist because ecological systems are dynamic, they have natural patterns. We can't possibly preserve all of those features. We have to understand what are the macroscopic regularities that make the systems what they are. The northeastern forests lost chestnut many years ago. The systems didn't collapse. If you like chestnut, then you've lost something, but other species came in and replaced the chestnut, and the systems continued to function. So one has to ask, what are the macroscopic features we want to preserve, and then ask, can we build models that relate those macroscopic features to the microscopic details? If we're interested in sustainability, we need to do something like was done with statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. We have to understand that when we put fluid under pressure, or when we try and boil water to make tea, we don't care what every molecule does. We're interested in the macroscopic outcome, but we recognize that the macroscopic features depend upon a lot of microscopic details. And it's a great triumph of statistical mechanics and thermodynamics to elucidate that relationship. Can we do similar things for the harder problems of understanding biological systems with lots, and socioeconomic system with lots of nonlinear interactions? The mathematical challenges, therefore, are to develop what I'll call a statistical mechanics of ecological communities and of the socioeconomic systems they're linked with, to model the emergence of ecological pattern, and to relate ecological and evolutionary timescales. Again, to ask, are there indicators of impending critical transitions between states? And ultimately, I want to know whether mathematics can help with the governance. I'll come back to that. So individual-based models have been quite successful in a number of applications. For this, I thank my collaborator, Ian Cousin. We've been working on models of schooling of fishes. Others have worked on models of flocking of birds. Glenn Flarrell here and I, with others, have been trying to develop a framework to look at such interactions, building models that start, and I'll talk about some of those, start from what individuals do to understand the macroscopic outcomes. But not just for these populations. Forest growth models have been very successful. Again, this, for example, work of my colleague Steve Pacala, among others, in which individual trees are allowed to grow on a grid. Those trees, as they grow up, shade out others, take nutrients from them. One develops models based on allometries in the system and can develop individual-based simulations that reproduce not obviously where every tree is going to be, but the statistical properties on the ensemble. And these can be scaled up, and and several of you have worked on these sorts of problems, and are very successful in explaining global patterns, identifying what we saw at the beginning, the kinds of vegetation that would be in particular regions, classes of trees, essentially ecotypes. Not just for forest systems, but here, as many of you know, Mick Follow and Penny Chisholm and others have been developing similar models based on detailed integration of biological models and physical fluid dynamical models of the oceans, in which simple relationships, allometric relationships are input, and then in one way or another, one looks at the competition among types to ask who wins out. Again, these models have been very successful, and I thank Mick and Stephanie Dutkowitz for this, in predicting not where individual species will be, but how ecotypes will be distributed around the globe. So it can be done. One has to understand what it is that one can expect to predict and what details are basically not predictable. The same can be done, and I'll come back to talk of this at the end, but less effectively, I think, in dealing with the decisions individuals make and how they develop consensus and in socioeconomic systems. So I've talked about the robustness, I've talked about scaling, and for the rest of the lecture, I want to turn to an aspect that's been involving a lot of my time and is probably less familiar to you here, which is how do we deal with what are called problems of the commons? How do we deal with conflict between microscopic and macroscopic agendas? And if it's not clear what I mean, let me give you some examples. Public goods and common pool resource problems are widespread in socioeconomic and ecological systems. Public goods are things, and common resources are things we all share, and in which perhaps none of us has sufficient individual incentive to protect. So if we're going to protect them for society, we have to find a way to restrain our tendencies to overconsume. So I gave two examples here. One is a socioeconomic public goods problem, which fishermen and oil rigs and other uses compete for a resource, and a termite mound, which is also a public good that individuals have to contribute to build, that everybody benefits from, but it would be easy to cheat and not make the investment necessary to help produce it. So going back to the starlings, maybe the most obvious public good is information. In any sort of assemblage of this sort, some individuals are taking the lead, some are out on the edge, some are gathering the information, and others are basically following and stealing information from others. Now that may change over time, but at any one time, the issue is, why should I make the investment in the costly things? Even though it benefits the group, why don't I let somebody else do it? Tumors are something you may not have thought of as a public good, but a tumor is obviously a breakdown of the common good of the individual, because cancer cells start to proliferate at a rate which is, in the short term, good for them, is going to destroy the host. Interestingly, tumors themselves depend upon public goods. The tumor cells produce substances like cytokines that are crucial for the growth of the tumor. And so together with David Dingley, an oncologist, and George Pacheco and Karina Tarnita, we've got a project which we hope is underway to try to use evolutionary game theory to deal with cancer because David has been able to evolve cells that do not produce the cytokines. They're cheater cells. And the trick is, can we get them to proliferate? If they proliferate, they will not be producing the substances necessary for tumor growth. So another public goods problem. Organisms in the oceans produce siderophores that chelate iron in order to have it available, but it's out there and others could steal it. Plants fix nitrogen. Again, it's costly to fix the nitrogen. Why is it that I should make that investment instead of just taking what's in the soil by sneaking up next to you? Antibiotics, this is a good example of a public good in two different ways. In nature, organisms produce antibiotics that poison other individuals, and if I can evolve the capacity simply to be resistant to those antibiotics, I can free ride on your efforts in poisoning my competitors. But you're probably all aware of antibiotics as a public goods problem in our society in a very different way, in that the overuse of antibiotics, both by physicians and in agriculture, is eroding the effectiveness. But when my granddaughter has an ear infection and I take her into the doctor, I don't want the doctor to tell me, well, maybe we shouldn't use the antibiotics because it's eroding the public good. I care about her at that time. And finally, though I won't talk much about it, is that bacteria produce extracellular polymers that keep dentists in business. They are crucial to the production of biofilms. They are signals for quorum sensing, and organisms like Pseudomonas aeruginosa and Vibrio cholera produce this. They produce these at different densities, and the compounds they produce are also crucial for providing a matrix for growth. Again, and we've done some research on this, asking under what conditions organisms will be selected to produce these. In these cases, and I'll come back to this over and over again, it's spatial structure that's crucial. Without the spatial structure, it's very hard to produce these substances, but with spatial structure, many of the benefits are local and therefore can feed back to benefit those to produce this. The prototypical public good is the commons that we all share, such as you see here. William Forster Lloyd, nearly 2 centuries ago, introduced this idea, and the solution, according to Garrett Hardin, in a 1950 paper, he called this the tragedy of the commons, was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. But what Garrett Hardin meant primarily was government-imposed actions that would force the mutual coercion. Elinor Ostrom, Nobel laureate who died sadly 3 or 4 years ago, showed that you didn't need top-down. You could evolve this cooperation from the bottom up, but in small communities, small fishing communities who developed, for example, ostracism and other measures to reinforce more prudent use of the resource. Globally, we're eroding our public goods, and there are 2 reasons. We discount the future, and we discount the future at too heavy a rate, and we discount the interests of others. This hasn't happened yet, but for those of you who fly often transatlantic or trans-Pacific, the idea of having somebody next to you with a strong battery cell phone talking all the way is probably not a pleasant thought. But why should she care here? She has her own business to take care of. In general, how do we get cooperation in societies? Contributions to public goods depend upon intrinsic prosociality, evolved prosociality, the amount that we care for our children and for others, but more often on reciprocal arrangements, contracts, and I'll talk some about those, and ultimately upon norms and laws and taxes and incentives. So a lot of my work now is in investigating these. There aren't many mathematical descriptions of these that are relevant to dealing with global environmental change, but they're going to be essential. So as an example of this is the work of Ernst Fair, who's a behavioral economist / psychologist. So Fair does experiments like the following. In a room of this sort, he gives everybody a certain set of resources that they can spend either on themselves, or they can put into the public pool, or they can use to punish others, presumably others that are not acting in the collective good. I play games based on this in my class, and it works very well. The game is played repeatedly, and everybody knows what everybody else has done. And so what happens initially is that people are selfish, but some people punish, and so that reduces the selfishness. And over time, cooperation emerges, and so does punishment. Even though punishment is costly, they co-evolve together. So indeed, humans will punish others who deviate from social norms. And as an example is the ultimatum game. In the ultimatum game, I say to Dan Rothman here, I'm going to give you $100,000, but you have to share it with that young woman in the back in any way you want. You offer her any fraction you want. She either accepts it or she doesn't. No negotiation. If she accepts it, then everything's fine. If she turns it down, neither one of you gets anything. Everybody knows the rules of this game. So in theory, she ought to accept anything. But I play this game in my class, and I gave a young man $100,000. I didn't really, by the way. And he offered $30,000 to the young woman he was supposed to give it to, and she rejected it. And I said, why are you rejecting it? It's costing you $30,000. And she said, yeah, but it's costing him $70,000. So everybody will pay something to punish individuals that they think are deviating from a social norm that society depends upon. Where your boundary is will depend upon the individual and the society. Punishment itself is a norm and can evolve from repeated interactions. So norms are really important to understand such pro-social behavior. Indeed, they become ultimately, if they work, formalized into rules and laws. An example, with 2 former students, Alessandro Tavoni and Maya Schluter, have been looking at fairness norms. I'll give you an example here. This is an example of the mutual coercion mutually agreed upon. And the idea is that individuals are drawing from some resource, whether it's a water pool or fishery, and agents can withdraw either at a cooperative rate, in which case they get a payoff of pi of c here. E is the effort and R is the resource level. Or they can be defectors, in which case they draw at a much higher rate. But the idea of our model is if you draw at a higher rate, you get a higher payoff, pi sub d, but then there's a cost because the individuals who are cooperators band together to ostracize the defectors. So the degree to which you're punished depends upon by how much you exceed the norm, and it also depends on the frequency of cooperators. The more cooperators there are, the more the stronger the punishment. So what happens here, as you will see, is you have to get the number of cooperators above a certain level, but this is what's called a coordination game. There are two stable equilibria, and the question is how do you get from the bad one to the good one? We also, the idea of looking at the dynamics is you have a resource dynamic that goes along with this, and then you replace in each generation individuals switch from being cooperators to defectors based on what they perceive to be the higher payoff. So that gives you a dynamic here. I won't go through it, but it says that dfc dt, the frequency of cooperators, is governed by this equation on the right. This comes out of very simple assumptions. And as I said, what happens is you get a diagram like this. This is how much more selfish the defectors are than the cooperators on this vertical axis. This is the frequency of cooperators, and the idea is you have to get the number of cooperators above a certain level in order to have the cooperative equilibrium that you see here. In societies, insurance agreements spread the risks and create public goods. As an example, we've been, with Avinash Dixit and Dan Rubenstein, looking at what's called agissement. What it basically means is that individuals, and this is prevalent in East Africa, share grazing grounds. And they also have group ranches. How does this work? When does this work? And so the framework that we looked at here says the following. Let's make it very simple, although we looked at more complicated versions. The way it works is there are a bunch of ranches around an area, and climate is variable. Let's suppose this year I'm having a bad year. My cattle are going to die. So I say to this gentleman here who's in the next ranch over, can I send my cattle over to graze on your land? And he says, why should I do that? And I say, well, next year the situation we know from experience might be reversed, in which case you should send, you can send your cattle over to me. So the idea is when one has a good year and the other has a bad year, you move M cattle. And one's making an investment in your land and in your cattle. And let's look at the mathematics of it. So first of all, we ask, what's the social optimum? We compute the total function. So this is the payoff, and the economists generally use what's called a Cobb-Douglas function, which means it's x to the alpha, z to the beta is your payoff, and this is the yield, A1. So if A1 is having the good year, we move M cattle over, and the payoff looks like this. And over here it looks like this, and this is the cost function from your investment. And you ask, a simple question, how do you maximize this? And you find out what would be the best solution. And that works fine if one person's in charge of moving the cattle. But the question is, if we now take away the government that's moving the cattle and just make this an arrangement between two individuals, is it what in game theory would be called a Nash equilibrium? Is it self-enforcing? Well, his decision to do it is going to depend upon his discount rate, how much he values this year relative to next year. But suppose it's not self-enforcing. So we now change an optimization problem into a game theoretic problem. If it's not self-enforcing, we can look for second best solutions in which he says to me, I'm not going to take all of your cattle, but you could send me 10, and I know that next year That means I can only send you 10 in a similar situation. So all of this can be mathematized. You can find the second best solution that's conditional in that way. In herder societies, the prosociality, largely due to kinship, can be important. That enhances cooperation. Having groups facilitates cooperation. The group structure creates the modules I talked about at the beginning for better cooperation. And I'm going to come back at the end to talk about what's called polycentricity as a model for dealing with climate change. With Avinash Dixit, I've been looking at problems of this sort. We have a paper in preparation now. And the idea is now, suppose we have multiple groups. Within each group, individuals can either invest in themselves or in the public good. And then the public good, capital Z, affects the payoff that I'm getting. Given the time, I'm not going to go through this model in detail, but the idea is that there's a payoff to an individual in group I, which depends on the prosociality, gamma, that other individuals in the group feel for me, and then there's leakage of the public good. If we beautify the area across the river here, people looking out their windows from MIT will still benefit. So I will skip over this given the time, but we look at the conditions under which prosociality will enhance the cooperative behavior. And we optimize the utility, and we show that a public contribution can emerge, but only because of local prosociality. But the local prosociality can produce global cooperation. And obviously, the topology of the network is important. And I want to lead this into the last thing I'm going to talk about, which is how to go towards climate change agreements. Herbert Simon, another Nobel laureate economist, some years ago talked about the importance of modularity. He talked about two watchmakers, one of whom made watches from beginning to end, and the other of whom made modules and put them on the shelf, and then at the end assembled them. Well, they both kept getting interrupted. And this fellow here never finishes, because every time he's had to start over again. But this guy who was saving his work never had to do worse than start over the module he was working on, and eventually he made watches. So modularity is important. It's like saving the drafts of your manuscript on your word processor, but it also creates building blocks that evolutionary biology has discovered that speed the ability to adapt and to change. And so increasingly, people are recognizing the importance of modularity in evolutionary biology, both at the genetic level and at the phenotypic level. Lynn Ostrom, in one of the last papers she wrote, argued that one should be thinking about this modular approach for dealing with climate change. And Bill Nordhaus, another leading economist, has been arguing for clubs, which are another way to think about modularity. The idea that you're not going to get 200 nations together to agree on a climate agreement. Kyoto has never worked because of that, but you have to build up regional or other sorts of associations, and that ultimately will be the building blocks. So with George Pacheco and Vitor Vasconcelos and Phil Hanneman, I've been looking at various models of that form. I'll just give you the basic ingredients of it. The idea is you form clubs. And these clubs could be things like the European Union, et cetera. Individuals pay a price to belong to the club. Once they're in the club, those clubs can take actions like mitigating emissions. Not everybody in the club need agree, so within the club, you have a group of cooperators. So there are 3 levels here. And individuals, the nations belong not just to one club grouping. They may belong to NATO, they may belong to the WHO, et cetera. So they're associated with each other in different ways. And the idea is that there are 3 levels of payments and there are 3 levels of payoffs. So individuals then decide whether to join groups or not, depending on the payoffs that they perceive. individual nations in this case. And we look at this as a birth-death process. I don't want to talk about the infinite limit, but what we see, first of all, is something that imitates the way, you can't read this, I know, but these are various international agreements and how they have built up over time. By varying parameters in our models, we can imitate things like the Baltic Sea regime, the Atlantic Treaty System, et cetera. And they all depend upon starting from small club sizes. Ultimately, we show that the dynamics of the system can lead to an agreement, but an agreement that depends very much on the modular approach of the system. And what you're seeing on the bottom axis here is basically the degree of modularity in the system, and what you're seeing on the vertical axis is a measure of the public goods that are provided in the system. So going to this modular arrangement can facilitate the construction of agreements that might work to deal with international agreements. So just a few more comments. Collection action can be effective if it includes enforcement, as in Ernst Fair's demonstration. Prosociality is important. And the last question is, how are collective decisions made? Just a few words on that. Ian Cousin and I, with others, have been interested for some years in the role of leadership and collective decision-making, for example, in those fish populations in which Ian does experiments. So we built a model. If I say I mean we at any point. If I say we, I mean Ian did it. So in which every individual has a direction and gets to change its direction at each time period in relationship to where it thinks it ought to go and where it observes others are going. So these individuals differ. They differ based on the degree to which they rely on their own information and the degree to which they simply steal information from others. Remember, I said information is sort of the ultimate public good. So we've looked at some of these things evolutionarily, but here you see what happens if you have 100 individuals, one of whom wants to go here and 99 of whom do nothing but follow. And this one individual keeps being drawn back into the pack, can't get it to go anywhere. If I change that one individual to 5, the group organizes itself and eventually moves up towards the goal. If I change that 5 to 10, it does that very effectively, moving up towards the goal. So one thing we see is that animal groups can be led by a very small number of individuals. What you're looking at here are groups of different sizes, but this is the number of informed individuals, and for all of them, how fast you move towards the goal sort of saturates by the time you get up to about 10 informed individuals. But what if they don't all want to go the same place? Well, there are a couple of possibilities. One possibility, 5 want to go here, 5 want to go there, and eventually the group splits apart. But under other situations, we might get consensus, but like the American electorate, a consensus that flips back and forth between the two goals. And part of the reason for that is that once you get close to one goal, and think about the political analogy here, once you get close to one goal, then everybody's vectors are no longer aligned with each other. They're pointing towards the target, but they're pointing in different directions. And so, whereas all the ones who want to go up there are all pulling in the same direction. So when a party gets into power, infighting becomes more important, basically. So we've done a lot of work, much of it with Naomi Leonard, on models for consensus formation, for example, in fish schools. Ian's done experiments in which he trains individuals to targets with different degrees of conviction. But we also started looking at similar models of decision-making in human populations. And from all of these angles, whether it's the models of animal groups, whether it's the experimental work that Ian does, or the models that we borrowed from the social science literature, we get, these are the 3 systems we looked at. In all of those, it becomes clear that unopinionated individuals are crucial to the nature of consensus. Without them, the group is likely to split apart, but they provide a glue which forces you one way or the other, but it also has the characteristic that it produces sudden shifts. So the most recent example we've seen of this, I think, is the action on the Confederate flag in South Carolina. But there's been sudden attitudinal shifts on foot binding in China, on gender equality, on same-sex marriage, on smoking in public, et cetera. You know the list. That can happen rather dramatically. And understanding how that occurs, I think, is crucial to understanding how we might get action on climate change. In human societies, as in animal groups, there may be a few leaders and many followers. Sudden shifts in attitudes are given momentum by the large number of followers, and environmental action really has to be aware of that. We have to understand that legislative action sort of co-evolves with public attitudes, and it's very hard to invoke until you change public attitudes. So let me conclude. Managing the commons is both an environmental and an ecological challenge. In human societies, mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon works. Users self-organize to develop norms and institutions, to design sanctions, to get the cooperation, the individual restraint that's needed to manage the commons. Can cooperation be extended from Lynn Ostrom's group up to the global level? Well, I think so. I think it's going to have to depend on the modular approach, though. In general, if we look over evolutionary history or the evolution of the cultural evolution of social groups, the emergence of cooperation with groups is often to make it easier to fight other groups. And we have to recognize that, as some of you will remember, Pogo said when his friend Possum told him it's hard working on his stuff, we have seen the enemy and he is us. Adam Smith, the great economist, talked many years ago about the invisible hand, the idea that the invisible hand somehow was going to lead society to a favorable equilibrium. The baker, he said, often by pursuing his own interest is benefiting society. But we learned, if we didn't know it already, in 2008, that the invisible hand doesn't protect society. It gets us to some equilibrium, but not one perhaps that we like. And that's magnified for environmental systems. Years ago, people talked more about Gaia, that the biosphere was evolving in ways to allow us to continue to exist. Well, no evolutionary biologist could accept that. The biosphere will reach its own equilibrium, but it may not be one that includes us. There is no goddess Gaia. So understanding how to achieve international cooperation is at the core of achieving sustainability in dealing with our common enemy, environmental degradation, in order that we can achieve a sustainable future for our children and our grandchildren. Thanks very much.